She stood at the altar of a church she'd never seen before, in a town she'd never visited, about to marry a man whose face she didn't know. Behind her, somewhere back in the city, a powerful man with cold eyes and a signed contract believed he already owned her. Ahead of her, a stranger in a weathered coat, jaw set like stone, eyes that hadn't held warmth in years. Clara Bennett had exactly two choices left in her life: walk forward or disappear forever. She smoothed her worn dress with trembling fingers, lifted her chin, and walked forward. Drop a comment with your city. Let's see how far this story travels. Hit like and stay until the very end. You won't want to miss what happens on that mountain. The town of Hollow Creek smelled like wood smoke, rotting timber, and desperation. Three things Ethan Mercer understood better than most. He rode in from the north on a gray horse named Flint, arriving just after dawn when the sky was still the color of a bruise, and the cold had settled so deep into the ground that the mud had stopped even pretending to thaw. He hadn't shaved in 4 days. His coat had a tear along the left shoulder he kept meaning to fix and never did. The brim of his hat was pulled low, not from habit, but because he genuinely did not want to make eye contact with anyone in this town. He was here to get married. That thought alone sat in his stomach like a swallowed stone. Hollow Creek was dying the slow, unglamorous death of every frontier town that had outlived its purpose. The silver mine had gone dry 6 years back. Most of the merchants who'd built their hopes on steady traffic had already packed up and moved west toward better odds. What remained was the skeleton of ambition: a general store with half its shelves empty, a saloon that opened too early and closed too late, a church with a crooked steeple that somehow hadn't fallen yet, and maybe 300 people who either couldn't leave or had stopped believing they deserved better. Ethan tied Flint to the post outside the church and stood there for a moment, one hand still on the horse's neck. The animal turned its head and looked at him with enormous, patient eyes. "Don't give me that look," Ethan muttered. Flint looked away. Horses had no capacity for judgment. That was one of the few things Ethan genuinely liked about them. He had answered the preacher's advertisement 6 weeks ago on a cold night when the loneliness of the cabin had grown so loud it was starting to sound like something. He hadn't told himself it was loneliness at the time. He'd told himself it was practical. A ranch needed 2 sets of hands. Winter was brutal on one person alone. He was 34, not getting younger, and the cabin needed things he didn't know how to provide. Warmth, he supposed, in the way that had nothing to do with firewood. He had written exactly 1 letter. Short, factual, almost deliberately unappealing because some part of him had wanted the whole thing to collapse before it started. "I am a rancher on Blackthorn Ridge, north of Hollow Creek. 34. Widowed, though that word doesn't mean what most people think it means in my case. I have a cabin, enough land, and enough food to last 2 people through winter. I am not easy company. I don't have gentle habits. But I am honest, I work hard, and I will not treat you badly. If those terms are acceptable, write back." He had not expected anyone to write back. She had written back in 9 days. Her letter was also short. He had read it so many times the paper had softened along the fold lines. "Your honesty is more valuable to me right now than any kindness you might have invented. I have my own reasons for needing a fresh start that I would rather explain in person than on paper. I accept your terms, and I offer the same in return. No flowery language, no performance of hope, just 2 people laying out the basic terms of survival." He respected that. It didn't mean he wasn't terrified. The preacher's name was Aldous Fitch, a narrow man in his 60s with the hollow cheekbones of someone who'd been food insecure for most of his adult life, and the burning eyes of a man who'd replaced hunger with conviction. He met Ethan at the church door with the particular smile of someone performing ceremony while internally calculating how quickly this could be concluded. "Mr. Mercer," he extended his hand. "She arrived last night, stage from Cheyenne." "She here now?" "Inside. Her name is Clara Bennett, as you know from the correspondence, 28 years of age. She is—" Fitch paused in a way that made Ethan look at him more carefully. "She has had a difficult journey." "How difficult?" "Nothing improper," Fitch said quickly. "She is a respectable woman, but she came a long way in a short time, and I believe she is frightened, though she would not admit it under any circumstances. She carries herself with considerable, he searched for the word, resistance." "Resistance to what?" to anyone seeing her fear. Ethan almost said, "I understand that," but he didn't. He just nodded and went inside. The church interior was plain as plain could be. Wooden pews, a potbelly stove in the corner working hard against the cold, 4 candles on the altar that gave more shadow than light. There were 6 people in the pews. He didn't know any of them. He suspected they were townspeople who'd come for the entertainment of watching 2 strangers bind their lives together, which was as much spectacle as Hollow Creek got in November. And there she was, standing at the front of the church, facing the altar, her back to him. Brown hair pinned up with the kind of careful precision that takes a long time and leaves no room for error. A dark green dress that had been good quality once, maybe 2 years ago, and had been worn regularly since. Her hands were clasped in front of her, not loosely, not nervously, but with the deliberate stillness of someone who had decided that stillness was the only thing they could control. Her shoulders were straight, her head was up. She wasn't shaking or fidgeting or doing any of the things people did when they were barely holding themselves together. But when Ethan's boot heel landed on the wooden floor and she turned around, he saw it in her face, just for a fraction of a second before she closed it down. She was terrified. Not of him specifically, of all of it, of the enormity of what she'd done, where she'd ended up, what she was about to sign her name to. Then she looked directly at him, and the fear compressed itself into something harder and quieter, like a fist closing. Her eyes were dark and steady, a straight nose, a mouth pressed into a firm line, cheekbones slightly prominent in the way of someone who hadn't been eating quite enough. She was not softly pretty. He searched for the right word internally and couldn't find it. She was someone whose face told you she'd been through something real and had come out still standing, which was a different category from beauty entirely. He walked to the front of the church. For a moment, they just looked at each other. No polite greeting, no social performance. Just 2 people taking each other's measure across 3 feet of cold church air. "I'm Ethan," he said. "I know." A beat. "I'm Clara." "I know." Fitch cleared his throat loudly from the altar. The ceremony took 11 minutes. Ethan counted without meaning to. The vows were standard, recited from the prayer book, and neither of them embellished anything. When Fitch asked if anyone present had objections, one of the townspeople actually shifted in their pew. Ethan shot a look in that direction, and the shifting stopped immediately. He put the ring on her finger. Plain silver, bought in Hollow Creek that morning. It didn't fit quite right. Slightly too large. She noticed. He noticed her noticing. Neither of them said anything. "You may," Fitch began. "I know," Ethan said and stepped back. Clara's mouth did something that almost became a smile. They signed the papers in the vestibule. Clara's handwriting was sharp and clean and pressed down hard into the paper. Ethan's signature was barely legible, as always. The ink dried. Fitch witnessed it. The 6 townspeople filed out. It was done. The ride up the mountain started in early afternoon and the sky was already failing, the light going thin and gray in the way it did in November up at elevation. Snow had started by the time they reached the first switchback. Not a blizzard yet, just the leading edge of something that intended to be worse later. Ethan had brought a second horse, a steady roan mare named Ellis, for Clara's use. Clara had 1 bag. Not a trunk, not a case. A single canvas bag she'd tied to Ellis's saddle without asking for help. When Ethan had moved to assist, she'd already done it. He noted that. They rode mostly in silence, which should have been awkward, and somehow wasn't. The mountain didn't leave a lot of room for small talk. It was too present, too demanding. The wind had opinions, the snow had intentions, and the trail required actual attention. Clara rode well. Not showily, not with the affected ease of someone performing competence, but with the quiet focus of a person who had learned something practical and taken it seriously. He found himself watching her from the corner of his eye, then deliberately stopping. About an hour into the ride, she spoke. "How much further?" 2 hours, weather depending. She looked at the sky, assessing. "The weather's going to have opinions." "Yeah." "Is the cabin solid?" "Solid enough." She nodded, seeming to accept this, and turned her attention back to the trail. Then after another few minutes, "You said in your letter you were widowed, but you said it didn't mean what most people think." He hadn't expected her to bring that up so directly. Most people danced around the hard questions. "She didn't die," he said. "She left." "Before or after?" "Before." She never came up the mountain. Clara was quiet for a moment, processing this. That's a particular kind of loss, she said finally. He looked at her. There was no pity in her voice, which he appreciated, just recognition of a fact. It is, he agreed. Neither of them spoke again for another 20 minutes. The snow thickened. The trees closed in around the trail, tall pines that had been growing on this mountain for longer than the town of Hollow Creek had existed, old enough that their roots had broken rocks. Ethan knew this trail in the dark, in a blizzard, half asleep. He'd been making this climb for 12 years, but he found himself seeing it slightly differently today, imagining it through someone else's eyes, someone who had never been here, who had no context for what was at the end of it. It's quiet up here, Clara said. Not a complaint, an observation. Yeah, I like quiet. A pause. Or I thought I did. This is a different kind. City quiet is full. Like everyone stopped talking, but the noise is still there underneath. This is... She trailed off, looking at the trees. Empty, Ethan offered. I was going to say honest. He didn't respond to that, but he thought about it for the rest of the climb. The cabin appeared through the tree line in the last gray light of the afternoon, half hidden by the pines, snow already accumulating on the roof. It was not a pretty structure. It was a functional one. Thick log walls, small windows set deep into the wood, a solid chimney, a covered porch along the front that kept the worst of the weather off the door. It had been built to last, not to impress. Ethan had added to it twice over the years, an extra room on the east side and a proper storage cellar, but the bones were original and showed their age. He climbed down from Flint and went to take Ellis's reins so Clara could dismount. She was already on the ground by the time he got there. He started up the porch steps, then heard her stop behind him. He turned. She was standing in the snow, perfectly still, looking at the front door. Specifically at the door frame, slightly above eye level, where years ago someone had used a carving knife to cut two sets of initials into the wood. EM plus LC. His initials. And hers. The woman who had never come. He'd stopped seeing it years ago, the way you stopped seeing things that had been in front of you long enough. He saw it now. He saw it the way Clara was seeing it, as the physical evidence of another life, another woman, another future that had happened in this exact spot before she arrived. Those, he started. I see them, Clara said quietly. She walked past him into the cabin without another word. He stood on the porch for a moment, alone in the snow, feeling the particular discomfort of being caught in something he hadn't even realized he'd done. He followed her inside. The cabin interior was clean, at least. He'd made sure of that. Swept out, fire laid and ready to light, the table clear. He had not, however, removed the things that still remained from before. He hadn't thought about them because he'd stopped thinking about them. They had simply become part of the background of the place he lived, like the knots in the wood and the way the floor sloped slightly toward the east window. But Clara saw all of it. She moved through the cabin slowly, setting her bag down by the door, her eyes taking quiet inventory. The old quilt folded over the back of the chair near the fire, the one with the yellow border that he hadn't touched in years. A tin cup on the shelf that didn't match any of the others, small and painted with a pale flower around the rim. And on the windowsill of the east room, barely visible, a wooden box with a cracked lid that Ethan had pushed to the back and forgotten. Clara did not open the box. She looked at it for a moment and then turned to face him. He'd been watching her from the doorway, not knowing what to do with his hands. Light the fire, she said. Her voice was neutral. I'll start on supper if you show me where things are. Clara, the fire first, she said. It's cold in here. He lit the fire. She found her way around the small kitchen corner of the cabin with efficient, no-nonsense movements, locating the flour, the dried beans, the salt, the hanging bundle of dried herbs above the window. She didn't ask for help. She didn't make small talk. The fire caught and spread. Outside, the storm that had been threatening all day finally committed, and the wind hit the cabin walls with a sound like something angry trying to get in. They ate supper across from each other at the wooden table. Bean soup, cornbread that she'd made from scratch faster than he expected, coffee that she made strong in a way that surprised him pleasantly. The fire pushed back the cold. The lamp on the table threw warm light across everything. It should have been fine. It was not fine. The silence between them had changed from the comfortable riding silence on the trail to something with an edge to it, something waiting. He watched her tear off a piece of cornbread and chew it and not look at him, and he knew that this thing was not going to go away by being ignored. Her name was Louisa, he said. Clara's hand stilled. She looked up. We were supposed to marry in the spring. She rode up the mountain once to see the cabin. After that, she started finding reasons to delay. By fall, she'd married a man from Denver. I heard later she told people the mountain was no place to build a life. He paused. I stayed anyway. Clara set down the cornbread. Because you believe she was wrong, or because you didn't know where else to go? Both, he said. Mostly because it was already my mountain. She was not the whole reason I was here. She just made it lonelier when she left. Clara was quiet for a moment, and he could see her deciding something. I almost didn't come, she said. I stood at the stage stop in Cheyenne for 40 minutes with my bag, and I nearly bought a ticket going the other direction. I didn't even know where the other direction led. I just almost did it. What stopped you? Your letter. She looked at him steadily. You said you were honest and you would not treat me badly. I decided those two things were more than I had where I came from, so they were probably more than I'd get if I kept running. The wind drove hard against the cabin walls. The fire crackled and spat. The lamp flickered once and settled. Those initials, Clara said, on the door. I'll take them off. I'm not asking you to. I'm asking you to tell me honestly. She held his gaze across the table, and there was something in her eyes he couldn't quite name, something harder than accusation and more serious than hurt. Do you see me as the woman who came after your life ended, or as the start of something different? The question hit him somewhere behind the sternum, not because it was unfair, because it was exactly the right question, and he didn't immediately know the answer. He sat with it for a long moment. The fire, the wind, the lamp, her eyes across the table. I don't know yet, he said finally, but I showed up, and so did you. She held his gaze for another few seconds, then nodded. Not as agreement, but as acknowledgement that at least the answer was honest. Then we start there, she said, and picked up her cornbread again. The storm lasted 3 days. 3 days of being confined inside a 2-room cabin with a stranger you'd married less than 48 hours ago, with nothing but a blizzard outside and 4 walls inside, and the constant presence of all the things they hadn't said yet. It was not romantic, it was not easy, it was not the graceful opening of a new chapter. It was uncomfortable in the specific way that proximity to another person can be uncomfortable when you have spent years alone. Every small habit suddenly visible, every preference suddenly a negotiation. Ethan had spent years developing an entire system of solitary living that had calcified into ritual. He woke at 5, before light. He made coffee in a particular order. He split wood in the morning, always morning. He didn't talk before he'd been awake for an hour. He ate supper at the same time every night, and went to bed at the same time every night and lived by a quiet internal clock that had never needed to account for anyone else. Clara had her own interior rhythms that were entirely different, and not apologetic about it. She read by lamplight late into the night and so slept later in the mornings. She reorganized the kitchen corner on the second day without asking, moving things to positions that made more sense to her, which made no sense to him. She talked while she worked, not to him particularly, just aloud, a running commentary on whatever she was doing that he found disconcerting at first, and then, after about a day, realized he was listening to without meaning to. You're doing it again, he said on the second evening. She looked up from where she was repairing a split in one of the pack bags with a bone needle and heavy thread. Doing what? Talking to yourself. I'm talking to the bag, she said, returning to her work. It's being uncooperative. She pushed the needle through. Do you mind? He considered it. No, he admitted. She glanced up. You're surprised you don't mind? Little bit. She almost smiled and went back to the bag. On the morning of the third day, he woke before dawn as usual, pulled on his coat, and went to the front door to check the weather. Clara was already at the east window, standing in the lamplight with a cup of coffee in both hands, looking out at the snow. Her hair was down. He hadn't seen it down before. It fell past her shoulders and was slightly wavy in the way hair got when it had been pinned up for a long time. She turned when she heard him and held out the second cup of coffee on the table without comment. He took it. They stood in silence, him at the door, her at the window, looking at the white world outside. It's easing, she said. Yeah. Should clear by midday. She nodded, drinking her coffee. There was something in her shoulders this morning that was different. A very small degree of unwinding, some infinitesimal reduction of the coiled spring tension she'd carried since the church. The mountain had gotten to her, he thought. Not broken her, just settled something. That box, he said, on the windowsill. She looked at it. It was still there, where she hadn't touched it. Louise's things? Yeah. He paused. I'll burn them. You don't have to do that. I want to. He looked at her. They shouldn't be here. Clara turned the coffee cup slowly in her hands. It's your cabin. You decide what stays and what doesn't. It's your cabin now, too, he said. The words came out simpler and more direct than he'd intended. She looked at him for a moment with an expression he couldn't fully read, and then she looked back at the window. Then I'd like the box gone, she said quietly. Not because I'm frightened of her memory, because this place needs to be what it actually is, not what it was supposed to be. He took the box from the windowsill, carried it out to the snow, and burned it in the fire pit beside the woodpile. It took longer than expected because the damp had gotten into it. He stood in the cold and watched it burn anyway, all the way down. When he came back inside, Clara was making breakfast. She didn't acknowledge what he'd done. She didn't need to. The storm cleared. The mountain emerged from under its white blanket into a sharp, brilliantly cold morning that turned everything to glass. Ethan went out to check the stock, break the ice on the water trough, assess what the storm had taken from the fence line. Clara came with him. He hadn't asked her to. She'd simply appeared beside him, bundled in her coat with her worn leather gloves, and fallen into step. You don't have to, he started. I know what I have to do, she said, and went to the far end of the fence line without being directed. They worked for 3 hours, side by side and apart, repairing what the wind had damaged, moving in the comfortable, nonverbal way of people who are either very familiar or occasionally just practically suited to each other without knowing why yet. Ethan found himself adjusting his pace to hers without thinking about it. She found the break in the fence before he did. Post split down here, she called. I see it. Need the mallet. Got it. She'd already picked it up from where he'd left it 6 feet back. He looked at her. She was already working, hammering the makeshift brace into the frozen ground with the focused aggression of someone who had something to prove. Or perhaps nothing to prove, but simply the habit of working hard, because hard work was the only thing that had ever reliably paid off. You've done this before, he said. My uncle's farm in Pennsylvania, 6 summers when I was a girl. She drove the brace down with another solid hit. I was small, but I was stubborn. Still stubborn, I take it. She looked at him over her shoulder. You have no idea, she said, and she was not entirely joking. That evening, with the fence mended and the stock fed and the sky going dark violet above the ridgeline, they sat at the table with supper, venison stew that Ethan had made this time, from a deer he'd taken in October and packed away in the cold cellar. It was better than the bean soup. He didn't say that. He didn't need to. Clara had found the wooden box of old documents in the bottom shelf. Property surveys, notes, a letter from the land office. She was reading through them with the focused attention of someone building a mental map. Your eastern boundary's not registered, she said. He looked up from his bowl. What? This survey. She turned the paper toward him. The eastern boundary. It's described but not formally registered with the county. That could cause trouble if someone ever contested it. Who would contest it? I don't know yet, she said. But I spent 2 years watching my father lose things he should have kept because he assumed goodwill was the same as legal protection. She set the paper down. It's not. He stared at her. You know land law. I know what happens when you don't have any. She held his gaze. I'd like to ride into town and file the proper registration when the weather allows. If you'll let me handle it. He was quiet for a moment, recalibrating something in his thinking about her. All right, he said. She nodded and went back to the survey. He ate his stew and watched the fire and thought about how she had arrived on this mountain with one bag and a borrowed future, and within 3 days she was already trying to protect it. He didn't know exactly what to do with that. He filed it in the back of his mind next to all the other things she'd done that he hadn't expected. After supper, he took his carving knife and went out to the front porch. The night was clear and sharp, and the stars were so bright at this elevation it almost hurt to look at them. He could see his breath. He could hear the silence, That specific mountain silence Clara had called honest, and he was beginning to understand what she meant by that. He looked at the initials in the door frame, EM plus LC. He'd carved those himself, at 22, full of the particular confidence of a young man who believed the future was a thing he could construct by sheer will. He'd stood here in the summer light and cut those letters into the wood with a steady hand, certain of what they meant. He put the knife to the wood. The carving came out harder than he expected. The wood had hardened over the years, the cuts had deepened slightly with weathering and time, and the knife slipped once on a knot in the grain and left a small gouge beside the letters. He swore under his breath and kept working. It took 20 minutes to clear the initials down to a rough, raw patch of exposed wood. Not invisible. You could still see where they'd been, the way you can always see where something was removed if you know to look. But they were gone. He put the knife in his coat pocket and stood on the porch alone in the cold for another minute, looking at the patched wood. Something had shifted. He wasn't sure yet what it meant or where it led. He only knew that he had spent 12 years on this mountain, mostly looking backward at the shape of what hadn't happened, and that somewhere in the last 72 hours a woman he barely knew had arrived and, without fanfare or sentimentality, had started filling up the present tense. He didn't know if that was love. He didn't know if it was anything yet. It was something small and cautious and, he thought, real in a way that mattered. He went back inside. Clara was reading by the lamp, her coffee going cold beside her, her hair still loose around her shoulders. She glanced up when the door opened and her eyes went briefly to the door frame. She saw the patched wood. She looked at him. He didn't say anything. Neither did she. She went back to her book. He sat in the chair by the fire and pulled out the leather he'd been working on all week, and the cabin settled around them both, quiet, imperfect, cold at the edges, warm at the center. Outside, the mountain endured as it always did. Inside, two people who had expected nothing began very carefully to expect something. The patch on the doorframe didn't disappear. That was the thing about wood. You could remove the letters, sand the surface raw, but the ghost of them stayed in the grain, visible at certain angles when the light hit just right. Clara noticed it every morning when she stepped outside. She never mentioned it. Ethan never mentioned it. They had, by unspoken agreement, decided to let the past be what it was, a scar that didn't require constant examination. December settled over Blackthorn Ridge with the patience of something that intended to stay. The days developed their own shape, the way days do when two people are forced to share a small space for long periods of time. Ethan was still up at 5, still had his first hour of silence, still split wood in the mornings with the mechanical focus of a man who needed something physical to do with his hands early in the day. Clara stopped trying to talk to him before his second cup of coffee, and he stopped flinching when she narrated her work aloud to no one in particular. These were small accommodations. They cost nothing and changed everything. What was harder to accommodate was the history that lived inside the cabin's walls. Clara found things she hadn't found in the first 3 days. A woman's ribbon, red and faded, tucked into the gap between 2 wall logs near the east window, so far back into the crack that it had probably been forgotten rather than hidden. A receipt from a dry goods store in Hollow Creek, dated 11 years prior, for fabric, thread, and 2 small glass buttons of a kind Ethan would have had no use for. These were not significant objects. They were exactly the kind of small domestic evidence that accumulated in any space where someone had once planned to build a life, and they had simply been overlooked because the man who lived here had stopped looking. She didn't bring them to him. She put the ribbon in the stove and used the receipt to start the kindling. But she thought about them. Specifically, she thought about what it meant to move into someone else's unfinished story and try to make it your own. It was a Thursday afternoon, gray and still, in the way that meant snow by evening, and Ethan had come in from the barn earlier than usual with a cut on his left hand where a tool had slipped on ice-covered wood. Clara was at the table going over the property survey she'd been studying for a week. She looked up at the blood, told him to sit down, and went to the medicine shelf for the cloth and the alcohol without being asked. "I can do it," he said. "Sit down," she said again, in the tone that meant she wasn't particularly interested in the conversation. He sat. She cleaned the cut. He hissed through his teeth at the alcohol, and she didn't sympathize because sympathy wasn't what the situation required, and began wrapping it with practiced efficiency. You've done this before too, he said, watching her hands. My father was not a careful man with tools, she said, or with most things, honestly. She tied off the wrap and sat back. That'll need a day before you're back out in the cold with it. The skin's not deep, but it'll pull open if you grip too hard. He looked at the bandage, then at her. Tell me about your father. The question came out more directly than he probably intended. She saw him realize it a second after he said it, saw the small flicker of something. Not regret exactly, but the awareness that he'd crossed into a territory he usually stayed out of. She didn't deflect. She'd spent enough of her life deflecting. His name is Thomas Bennett, she said, sitting back down at the table. Past tense for Ethan, present tense for her, because her father was still alive somewhere back east in the mess he'd made of his life. He's charming. That's the first thing you need to know, because charming people do damage in ways that are hard to explain to someone who hasn't experienced it. You keep thinking there must have been a moment where you should have seen it coming, and then you realize the charm was specifically designed to prevent that moment. Ethan was quiet, listening. He made bad business decisions for 20 years and covered them with borrowed money and borrowed time and the absolute conviction that the next venture would fix everything. By the time I was 25, he owed money to a dozen different men. She turned the edge of the survey paper between her fingers. Victor Hale was not like the others. The others wanted their money back. Victor wanted leverage. He had a lot of money and he liked owning things. When my father couldn't pay, Victor offered to cancel the entire debt. In exchange for you, Ethan said. In exchange for a marriage. She said it flatly, without performance. Victor needed a respectable wife. He had social ambitions that required a certain type of woman at his side. Educated, presentable, quiet enough not to cause trouble. My father convinced himself he was doing me a favor. Victor had money. Victor had a house in the city. Victor would take care of me. A short, humorless sound that wasn't quite a laugh. My father never asked me what I thought of being taken care of by a man I'd met 4 times. What did you think? I thought Victor looked at me the way men look at property they're considering purchasing. She looked up. So I packed one bag and left in the night and kept moving west until I ran out of money in Cheyenne, and that's when I saw the preacher's advertisement. The stove ticked and settled. Outside, the first snow had started, soft and quiet against the window. Did your father know where you went? Ethan asked. He knows I went west. He doesn't know exactly where. She paused. Victor is not the kind of man who lets things go. What does that mean, practically? She held his gaze. It means the debt doesn't disappear because I left. It means Victor likely still considers me his, in the way that men like him consider anything theirs once they've decided it. And it means that eventually, if he bothers to look hard enough, she stopped. He'll find you here, Ethan finished. Possibly. She said it without drama, because the possibility had been sitting in the back of her mind since she'd gotten on the stage in Cheyenne, and she'd made her peace with the weight of it. I'm sorry, I should have been clear about that in the letter. Ethan was quiet for a long moment. The snow outside was thickening, the light going that particular dim white of early mountain dusk. He looked at his bandaged hand and then at the fire and then at some middle distance that wasn't either of those things. You should have, he said finally, but you're here now. He met her eyes. We deal with things as they come. Clara looked at him. At the set of his jaw and the quiet in his voice, there was not softness, but something more reliable than softness, and felt something in her chest loosen a fraction, just a fraction. She wasn't built for easy trust. It had been managed out of her by years of watching people she depended on make decisions that cost her. But she filed the moment away. They ate supper that night with the storm moving overhead and the cabin holding its ground the way it had been built to do. And after the dishes, Clara sat in the chair near the fire and opened the book she'd been working through since she arrived. A battered copy of Middlemarch she'd carried in her bag across 3 states because there were things in it she needed to think about. Ethan sat across from her with a piece of saddle leather and the awe and the particular focused quiet of a man who worked best with his hands. Neither of them spoke. The fire said everything the room needed said. After a long while, without looking up from the leather, Ethan asked, "Is it a good book?" "It's about a woman who makes the wrong choices trying to do the right thing," Clara said. "So yes, I find it useful." He grunted, not dismissively, more in the way of a man who understood that usefulness was a legitimate criterion for most things. "You read much?" she asked. "Used to, less now." He pushed the awl through the leather. "Winter's good for it. I've got a few things on the shelf." She looked at the small shelf by the door. She'd noticed it before but hadn't gone through it. A Bible she could see wasn't read often. A worn almanac. 3 other books, spines cracked from use. She got up and tilted her head to read the spines. 2 years before the mast. Walden. The Count of Monte Cristo. She pulled the last one out, turned it over. It was in worse shape than the others, the binding repaired twice with different thread. "You've read this more than once," she said. He looked up. 4 times. She looked at the book, then at him, and something about that, a solitary man on a mountain reading about imprisonment, patience, and the long work of making things right, landed quietly in her understanding of who he was. She put it back carefully and returned to her chair. They didn't speak again for an hour. But the silence was different from the first night's silence, less like a wall and more like weather, present but not hostile, something you could sit inside without flinching. That was the closest thing to peace Clara had felt in 2 years. It didn't last. 3 days later, Ethan came in from checking the fence line along the north pasture and stopped in the doorway. Clara was at the stove, her back to him, stirring something that smelled of dried herbs and venison. He stood there a moment longer than necessary, and she turned around because she'd learned already to pay attention to his silences. There were the good ones and the ones that meant something had shifted. This was the second kind. "What?" she said. "Found something in the north pasture." He pulled off his gloves and set them on the peg by the door. "Someone's been cutting through the fence and pushing it back. Not an accident, too clean. Someone's crossing your land. Someone's been crossing it for a while, looks like. The ground's too frozen to see tracks well, but the cuts on the wire are old." He sat at the table, heavy. "Could be nothing. Hunters sometimes, but..." He looked at her. "But the north fence is the farthest from the trail. Hunters don't usually go that far in." Clara set the spoon down and turned fully to face him. The things she hadn't said about Victor, the part she'd held back 3 days ago when she'd said possibly, and eventually, was sitting in her throat now. "Ethan," she said carefully, "Victor Hale is not the type of man who sends himself to do his own investigating. He sends people first." The kitchen went quiet except for the stove. He held her gaze. "You think someone's watching the property?" "I think someone wants to know what they're dealing with before walking up the front path," she said. "I think Victor has money, and I think money buys patience, and I think we should not assume we have more time than we do." Ethan was still for a moment. She watched the thing moving behind his eyes. Not fear, but recalculation. The resorting of priorities that happened when a man realized the threat he'd dismissed as distant was closer than he'd let himself believe. "All right," he said. His voice was level. "What do you suggest?" The fact that he asked her, that he didn't reach for a simple solution or tell her she was overreacting, hit her in a place she hadn't expected. "I'll write to a friend in Cheyenne," she said. "Someone who moves in the same circles Victor does. Not a close friend, just a person who pays attention to things. I want to know if Victor has been asking questions." She paused. "And I think you should talk to the sheriff in Hollow Creek. Not about Victor specifically, just to establish that we're here, that we're a household, that if anything unusual happens on this land, you want to be told." "Preemptive," he said. "Victor operates in legal gray areas," she said. "He loves paperwork. He loves agreements that seem reasonable on their face. The best defense against that is having your own paperwork in order first." Ethan looked at her for a long moment, with the expression he sometimes had when she said something that landed differently than he expected. Not surprise exactly, but a subtle shift in the way he was seeing her. "The Eastern Boundary Registration," he said slowly. "Would have been important regardless," she said. "Now it's urgent." He nodded, stood up, went to the shelf and came back with the property documents, spreading them on the table beside her. "Show me what you found." They sat at the table together for 2 hours, maps and documents spread between them, and Clara walked him through everything she'd identified. The unregistered boundary, the unclear water rights on the North Creek, the survey description that could be interpreted 2 ways by a lawyer who wanted it to. She had clear handwriting and a methodical mind that had been trained, she explained, not by schooling but by 2 years of watching her father's attorney look for holes in things and either patch them or exploit them depending on which side he was being paid to be on. Ethan listened with his full attention. She noticed he didn't interrupt to show he already knew things. He asked questions when he had them and was quiet when he didn't. It was a quality she'd noticed before, but it struck her more acutely now. The rarity of a person who could be genuinely still and attentive rather than just waiting for their turn to speak. When they were finished, the lamp was burning low, and the stove had gone to coals, and the storm outside had settled into the steady, committed snowfall that meant morning would require shoveling. "I should have done some of this years ago," Ethan said, looking at the documents. "You didn't have reason to think about it." "Still," he gathered the papers slowly, "you've been here less than 2 weeks, and you found more problems with this property than I noticed in 12 years. "I was looking for them," she said. "You weren't. That's not failure, it's just different vantage points." He looked at her across the spread of documents, and she held his gaze because she'd stopped looking away from the hard moments. There was something in his face that she didn't have a clean word for. Gratitude, maybe, or the beginning of something larger than gratitude. "Clara," he said. "Yes." He was quiet a beat too long, and she saw him decide against whatever the first thing was and find something simpler instead. "Thank you," he said, "for all of this." "It's my land too," she said. "Now." It was the first time she'd said that. She saw him hear it. She got up and started banking the stove for the night, and Ethan folded the documents carefully back into the leather case, and outside the snow kept falling on Blackthorn Ridge like the mountain was trying to bury whatever was coming under enough white silence to slow it down. It couldn't, of course. Things that were coming didn't stop for weather. But that night at least the cabin was warm, and the documents were in order, and two people who had started as strangers were becoming, cautiously and imperfectly, something that was harder to threaten than either of them alone. End of part 2. The letter from Cheyenne arrived on a Thursday, 3 weeks after Clara had sent hers out with the mail rider. She recognized the handwriting on the envelope before she even turned it over. Margaret Hollis, who had worked as a seamstress in the same building where Clara had once taught piano lessons to the daughters of merchants, and who had the particular gift of knowing everything about everyone without appearing to pay attention to any of it. Clara read it at the table while Ethan was outside. She read it twice. Then she folded it carefully and put it in the inside pocket of her coat, where it sat against her ribs for the rest of the day, like a coal that hadn't decided yet whether it was going to burn through. That evening, after supper, she put the letter on the table between them. Ethan read it without expression, which was how he read most things. When he finished, he set it down flat and looked at the fire for a moment. Margaret had written in her careful, slightly cramped hand that Victor Hale had been asking questions in Cheyenne approximately 6 weeks ago. He had spoken to the stage line offices. He had spoken to 2 hotel owners. He had a man, a lawyer named Garfield, someone Margaret described as the kind of man who smiles more than he should, making inquiries about westward routes, about women traveling alone, about marriage advertisements posted by frontier preachers. He was looking. He was getting closer. 6 weeks ago, Ethan said. He's had time to narrow it down since then. He pushed the letter back toward her. How specific does he know to look? He knows I went to Wyoming Territory. He may know about Hollow Creek by now. She paused. The preacher's advertisement wasn't exactly private. Ethan was quiet for a long moment. Outside, the wind had a new edge to it, the kind that came before a temperature drop, and the cabin walls absorbed it with their usual stoic indifference. The fire needed another log. Neither of them moved to add one. When he comes, Ethan said. Not if, Clara noticed. And she noticed that he'd said when without flinching. What does he want exactly? Spell it out for me. He wants the debt honored, she said. The agreement my father signed with him stated that my father's debt would be canceled upon my marriage to Victor. Since that marriage didn't happen, Victor can argue the debt still stands. She folded her hands on the table. My father has nothing left to give him, so Victor comes for the next best thing. You, or leverage over me, or the satisfaction of making it clear that nobody walks away from a deal he's made. She said it without self-pity, which was harder than it sounded. Victor is not primarily about money. He has plenty of money. He's about the principle of the thing, the principle being that he doesn't get refused. Ethan looked at her steadily. And what does the law say? The law says a married woman's legal standing is complicated. Depending on the judge and the county, a husband's rights and a prior contract's enforceability can be argued either way. She met his eyes. Victor knows that. He'll come with papers that are designed to look more definitive than they are. So he'll look legal whether he is or not. That's his method, yes. The fire finally got low enough that Ethan leaned forward and added a log without ceremony, and the fresh wood caught and pushed the light back out across the room. Clara watched him do it and thought, not for the first time, about the specific texture of depending on someone you didn't fully know yet. It was like crossing ice in early spring. You moved forward because standing still was also a choice, and at least moving forward was your own. She did not want to be the thing that brought ruin to his door. She had thought about that more than she'd told him. "Ethan," she said, "if you wanted to, if you decided that the trouble wasn't worth—" "Don't," he said. "I'm being practical." "So am I." He looked at her with the directness she'd come to recognize as his version of emphasis. "You're not a problem I'm trying to manage. Don't talk about yourself like one." She absorbed that. "All right," she said after a moment. "All right," he said back, and that was the end of that conversation. They began preparing in the ways that were available to them. Ethan rode into Hollow Creek the following week and filed the Eastern Boundary registration at the county office, with Clara's careful documentation attached. He spoke to Sheriff Dale Purcell, a solid, unremarkable man who had held the job for 9 years by being reliably difficult to bribe, and laid out the situation in plain terms. That he had married, that his wife had left a prior arrangement under duress, that a wealthy man from back east might come asking questions or making claims, and that he wanted it noted in the sheriff's awareness in advance. Purcell had listened, asked 2 questions, and said, "You've got a legal marriage and registered land. That's a decent amount of ground to stand on. Will it be enough?" Purcell had looked at him with the eyes of a man who'd watched money override plenty of decent ground over the years. "It's what you've got," he said, "so make sure it's solid." Clara, meanwhile, went through everything. Every document, every receipt, every piece of paper in the cabin that touched on property, ownership, dates, transactions. She built a clear record of what they had and when they had it. She wrote a letter to a land attorney in Cheyenne, carefully worded, asking specific hypothetical questions about the enforceability of premarital debt agreements on a married woman in Wyoming Territory. The attorney's response, which came back in 2 weeks, was more useful than she'd expected and confirmed what she'd suspected. Victor's legal position was weaker than he would present it. Not non-existent, but weaker. She didn't tell Ethan that it was weaker. She told him it was complicated, because complicated was the truth, and she'd learned the hard way that the gap between weaker than expected and defeated was where things went wrong when people stopped paying attention. January turned hard, the way January on a high mountain always did, mean and relentless and deeply uninterested in human plans. Ethan worked through it with the mechanical stubbornness of a man who had learned that the mountain didn't respond to complaints, only to persistence. Clara had taken on the accounts and supply management with the focused energy of someone who needed her hands to be busy because the alternative was sitting with the low-grade dread that had taken up residence in her chest since Margaret's letter arrived. They were cutting timber on a morning in late January, Ethan with the axe, Clara stacking and binding, when Flint lifted his head suddenly at the far end of the clearing and went still in the way horses did when they heard something the humans hadn't registered yet. Ethan set the axe down without being told. Clara straightened and looked toward the trail. The rider came through the tree line at a walk. He was on a dark horse, well-fed and well-shod, which was the first signal. Working horses on this mountain looked like working horses. This animal looked like it had been brought up from somewhere with better roads and warmer stables. The man on its back wore a charcoal gray coat that had no business being on a mountain in January, and sat his saddle with the careful posture of someone who'd been told to project authority in every physical circumstance. He was younger than Clara had expected, maybe 40, with dark hair going silver at the temples, and a face that would have been handsome if it hadn't been arranged into the particular expression of a man who considered his own face a professional instrument. When he saw Clara, something moved across his features. Recognition first, then a smoothing out into pleasantness that was more unsettling than anger would have been. "Clara," he said. Not Mrs. Mercer. Clara, like she was still the woman he'd made arrangements for. "Mr. Hale," she said. Her voice was steady. She was proud of that. Victor Hale's eyes moved to Ethan with the assessing quality of a man pricing livestock at a fair. He took in the axe, the woodpile, the worn coat, the rough hands. Whatever calculation he ran, it finished fast. "Mr. Mercer," he said, inclining his head in a gesture that managed to be both polite and condescending in the same motion. "I apologize for the intrusion. I've ridden a long way, and I appreciate a moment of your time." "You've got it," Ethan said. He didn't invite Victor to dismount. He didn't move toward him. He stood where he was beside the woodpile with the axe leaning against his leg and waited. Victor dismounted anyway, because men like Victor Hale didn't wait for invitations. He tied his horse to a branch with the careful movements of a man who didn't want mud on his coat and reached into his inside pocket and produced a folded set of papers with the practiced ease of someone who'd done this before. "I won't make this complicated," Victor said, holding the papers out toward Ethan. "Thomas Bennett entered into a legal agreement with my firm in 1878. The terms were straightforward. The agreement has not been honored. I have come to discuss a resolution." Ethan didn't take the papers. Victor let his hand stay extended for a beat, then lowered it, folded the papers back, and smiled. The smile of a man who was used to people not wanting to touch his paperwork and had developed the patience for it. "The resolution I'm offering is simple and generous," Victor continued. "Claire returns with me voluntarily. The debt is canceled in full. No further action is taken against her father, and—" his eyes moved briefly to Ethan. "No legal challenge is made against the legality of this marriage." The last part landed the way it was designed to, with the soft thud of an implied threat wearing good manners. Clara felt something cold and specific move through her. Not fear exactly, fury mostly, the particular fury of watching someone treat the most significant decision of your life as a line item in a business negotiation. She opened her mouth. Ethan spoke first. "What's the total amount of the debt?" he said. Victor blinked. It was the first time something had caught him slightly off-footed. "I beg your pardon?" "The debt. What Thomas Bennett owes you. Total amount, including whatever interest you've attached to it." Victor studied him. "That's not the relevant—" "It's the only thing that's relevant," Ethan said. "Tell me the number." A pause. Victor named a figure. It was not a small one. Clara heard it and felt the cold in her chest deepen, because she knew what she was hearing. She was hearing the entire weight of her father's failure, and it was considerable. But Ethan's face didn't change. "All right," he said. "All right?" Victor repeated. "I'll pay it." Ethan looked at him with the flat, even gaze of a man who was not performing anything. "Timber, labor, whatever it takes. I'll pay the debt." Victor stared at him for a moment, and Clara watched the recalculation happen behind his polished surface. The quick assessment of whether this was a bluff, whether the numbers worked, whether a mountain rancher could actually make good on such a claim. He decided it was a bluff. She could see that in the small shift of his chin. "Mr. Mercer," Victor said, with the gentle patience of a man explaining something to someone who didn't understand the stakes. "The debt is substantial. The interest accumulated over 18 months is a loan." "I heard the number," Ethan said. "Then you understand it's not something a timber operation in Wyoming territory resolves in any—" "I understand it'll take years," Ethan said. "I understand it'll be hard. I understand you think I'll break under it before I finish." He paused. "You might be right, but here's what I know for certain." He held Victor's eyes, and his voice came out quiet and undecorated, without anger or theatrics. "I would rather destroy my hands earning her freedom than spend a single day knowing another man owns her life." The clearing went silent. Victor stood in his charcoal coat on a mountain he hadn't been built for, and for one unguarded moment something flickered in his face. Not admiration, not softness, but the rare and uncomfortable recognition of a person who operated entirely outside his frame of reference. He recovered quickly. "That is a fine sentiment," he said, "but sentiment doesn't satisfy a legal obligation." "No," Ethan agreed, "but I'll put it in writing with the sheriff of Hollow Creek as witness, and you can decide whether to take the deal or spend money on lawyers trying to argue it in a Wyoming court, which I expect will be more expensive and slower than you'd like." Victor looked at him. Then he looked at Clara. Clara looked back at him and said nothing, because there was nothing left to say. She had said everything she needed to say the night she packed her bag and walked out of her father's house. Victor had simply not been listening. He spent another 30 seconds in the clearing, holding the folded papers and the remains of his certainty. Then he tucked the papers back into his coat with a precise, unhurried motion. "I'll consider your proposal," he said. "I'll need figures, documentation, a schedule of payment." "You'll have it," Ethan said. "I'll return when the weather is more—" Victor looked at the sky, at the trees, at the general inhospitality of Blackthorn Ridge in January. Suitable. He mounted his horse with the care of a man who would not let himself appear rattled, turned the animal toward the trail, and rode back into the trees without looking at either of them again. The sound of hooves on frozen ground faded. The wind came back in behind it. Clara stood in the snow for a long moment, her hands still at her sides, watching the empty tree line. Then she turned and looked at Ethan. He was watching her. The axe was still leaning against his leg. He looked exactly the same as he had before Victor rode in, coat torn at the shoulder, jaw rough with several days' growth, eyes steady, and that steadiness hit her somewhere behind her breastbone with a force she hadn't been prepared for. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "I know. That's a significant amount of money. That's years of—" "I know what it is," he said. "Ethan." She stopped, started again. "Why?" He picked up the axe and set it against the woodpile and turned back to her, and his voice when he spoke was not the voice of a man making a grand gesture. It was the voice of a man stating a practical fact that happened to matter enormously. "Because you showed up," he said. "You packed one bag and you left everything you knew, and you rode up a mountain in a snowstorm to marry a stranger who told you up front he wasn't easy company. And since you got here, you've fixed my fence records, identified problems with my land I missed for 12 years, and kept this place running while I was trying to figure out what to do with someone else being here." He paused. "You didn't come here to be a burden. You came here to build something. That deserves protecting." Clara stood in the cold and felt something she hadn't felt in so long she almost didn't recognize it. The specific sensation of being seen accurately. Not idealized, not diminished, seen. She did not cry. She was not built for crying in clearings in January. But something in her face must have moved, because Ethan looked at her for a moment and then deliberately looked away, giving her the privacy of the moment in the way he'd learned. Apparently, that she needed. "We should finish stacking before the light goes," he said. She exhaled. "Yes," she said. "We should." They went back to work, him with the axe, her with the rope and the stacking, and the clearing filled back up with the ordinary sounds of two people doing the ordinary work of surviving winter on a difficult mountain. The fear was still there, settled into the background where it lived. Victor would come back. The debt was real. The road ahead was long and expensive and uncertain. But Clara stacked timber in the fading January light and felt, for the first time since she was a child, like someone was standing between her and the worst of what the world could do. That was more than she had ever let herself ask for. It scared her more than Victor Hale ever had. End of Part 3. Victor Hale sent his answer 12 days later. Not in person, but through his lawyer. Garfield arrived in Hollow Creek on a Wednesday, checked into the only boarding house in town, and spent Thursday visiting the sheriff's office, the county clerk, and the general store, in that order. By Friday, half of Hollow Creek knew that a city attorney was asking questions about Ethan Mercer's marriage and the land up on Blackthorn Ridge. Small towns had their own information systems, faster and less reliable than telegraph, and the version that reached Ethan through the supply merchant on Saturday morning had already accumulated several layers of interpretation and embellishment. But the core of it was accurate enough. Garfield had reviewed the payment proposal Ethan sent down with a rider the week before, and Victor's response was that he would accept the repayment schedule in principle, but that the terms required formal documentation, witnessed signatures, and a guarantor. Someone other than Ethan himself who could verify the debt would be honored if Ethan couldn't make the payments. "He wants a guarantor," Ethan said, standing at the table with the merchant's note in his hand. Clara looked up from the accounts she'd been working on. "That's his opening move. He doesn't expect you to find one. He expects you to fail that condition, and then he comes back with a counter that looks more reasonable by comparison." "So the whole thing is theater." "The whole thing is negotiation," she said. "Victor's version, which means the rules favor him from the start." She set down her pen. "Do you have anyone who would stand as guarantor? Someone with property, established credit, someone the county would recognize. Ethan thought about it. The honest answer was not encouraging. He had lived on this mountain deliberately apart from most of the town's social architecture. He had neighbors he respected and neighbors who respected him, but the relationship was built on distance and mutual non-interference, not the kind of close alliance that produced men willing to sign their name to someone else's debt. Possibly Walt Greer, he said slowly. Walt ran the largest working ranch in the valley below Hollow Creek, a weathered, profoundly unsentimental man who had known Ethan's father and who had twice in the past decade done business with Ethan on timber. He was not warm, he was not generous, but he was fair, which was rarer. "Go talk to him," Clara said. "He might say no." "He might," she agreed, "but right now he definitely hasn't said yes. And those are different problems." Ethan went to see Walt Greer on Monday. The conversation took 2 hours and covered ground that Ethan found deeply uncomfortable. His financial position, his timber contracts, his capacity for the work the debt would require, the specifics of Victor's claim, and the legal documentation Clara had assembled. Walt listened to all of it with his arms crossed and his face expressing nothing warmer than geological patience. At the end of it, Walt said, "That woman of yours did this documentation?" "Yes." "She know what she's doing?" "More than I do." Walt was quiet for a long moment, looking out the window at his own land. Then he said, "Your father was a straight dealer. I'll stand as guarantor on the first third of the payments. After that, you're on your own." He looked at Ethan. "Don't make me regret it." Ethan rode back up the mountain in the last light of the afternoon and told Clara what Walt had said. She received the news with the contained relief of someone who had been managing her expectations carefully and was now carefully allowing one of them to be met. "A third is enough to satisfy Garfield's condition," she said. "Victor won't like it, but he can't reject it on legal grounds if the documentation is clean." "Can you make it clean?" She was already pulling out the papers. "Sit down," she said. "This is going to take a while." It took most of the night. What came next was work. Not the dramatic sudden kind, the long, grinding, daily kind that wore at a person in ways that were hard to describe to anyone who hadn't done it. Ethan increased his timber output by a third, which meant longer days in colder conditions with a body that was 34 years old and had been doing hard physical labor since it was 16. He negotiated a new contract with the mill in the valley, better rates in exchange for consistent volume, and began cutting timber through February's worst weeks with the deliberate aggression of a man who had decided that the mountain could take its best shot. Clara managed everything he couldn't do from the ridge: the accounts, the supply orders, the correspondence with Garfield, the quarterly payment documentation that had to be precise because Garfield would be looking for any inconsistency to flag. She rode into Hollow Creek twice a month on the supply runs, which she'd taken over because Ethan's time was worth more on the mountain than on the trail. She learned the merchants by name. She learned their patterns, who was reliable, who would price gouge if she wasn't paying attention, who had goodwill to offer, and what it cost. Hollow Creek, meanwhile, had opinions. The town's relationship with Ethan had always been the kind of respectful indifference extended to solitary men who didn't cause trouble and paid their bills. Clara's arrival had briefly made him interesting in the way that unexpected marriages made any man interesting for a few weeks. But the rumor that a city lawyer was sniffing around Ethan's land on behalf of a wealthy Eastern creditor, that made things more complicated. Some people thought Ethan had made a fool's bargain. Ruth Calloway, who ran the boarding house and had strong opinions about most things, told Clara directly on a February supply run that she hoped Clara understood what she'd brought down on a good man by running from her obligations. It was said with the particular self-righteousness of a woman who had never been in a situation where running was the only option and had concluded from that absence that the option didn't exist. Clara looked at Ruth Calloway for a moment and then said very calmly that she appreciated the concern and would pass it along, and walked out of the boarding house without buying anything, which cost Ruth a sale and, she suspected, bothered Ruth considerably more than the speech had bothered her. There were others who took a different view. The Hendersons, a couple who ran the dry goods, had been quietly supportive since Clara started doing the supply runs. Mrs. Henderson in particular, who had her own complicated history with men who made promises and left women to deal with the consequences. She'd slip an extra pound of flour into the order sometimes, or tip Clara off when a supply price was about to change, small practical kindnesses that cost nothing and meant something. But the opinion that mattered most, the one that had the most weight in Hollow Creek's informal social court, was Sheriff Purcell's, and Purcell had watched the whole situation unfold with the careful attention of a man who kept his judgments close until he was sure of them. He said little publicly. But when Garfield came through town a second time in March with additional paperwork, Purcell had reportedly asked him several pointed questions about the original debt agreement's enforceability under territorial law. Questions detailed enough that Garfield had gone quiet in a way that suggested he wasn't entirely confident of his answers. Clara heard this secondhand from Mrs. Henderson and filed it under things that were encouraging but not sufficient. The payments went out on schedule. First month, second month. Ethan's hands cracked and bled in the cold, and he wrapped them in cloth soaked in the pine tar salve Clara made from a recipe she'd learned from her mother and kept working. Clara's back ached from hunching over the accounts table, and she straightened up, rolled her shoulders, and kept working. They were both tired in the particular bone-level way of people who were spending more than they had and hoping the math eventually worked out. There were hard nights. One night in early March, late, with the fire burned down to coals and Ethan sitting at the table with the account ledger in front of him and his face doing the thing it did when he was calculating and not liking what he found, Clara came in from the cold room where she'd been checking the food stores and stood in the doorway watching him for a moment before he heard her. He looked up. His eyes had the flat tiredness of someone who'd been fighting the same battle for weeks and was doing the math on how many more weeks it required. "It's manageable," she said before he could speak. "I know it's manageable," he said, which meant he'd been sitting there convincing himself of that. She came to the table and sat across from him and looked at the ledger. She'd seen worse numbers. She'd also seen better. "The March payment is covered. April is tight, but covered. If the mill contract holds, it'll hold. Then we're all right through summer." She looked up at him. "That's not nothing." "It's 3 more years of this," he said. "Not complaining, just measuring." "Yes," she said. "It is." He looked at her across the ledger. "You didn't sign up for 3 years of ledger work and half rations and a mountain full of gossip about your past." "I signed up for honest terms and not being treated badly," she said. "You've held to both." A pause. "Have I?" He looked at her. "Have you what?" "Held to my end." "Clara Sohn," he said, with the particular tone he used when he thought she was being willfully obtuse about something obvious. "You've been doing 3 people's work since November. I meant, have I made this harder than it needed to be? By bringing Victor here, by the debt, by—" "Stop," he said. She stopped. "I made the offer to Victor," he said. "That was my choice. I knew the numbers." He held her eyes. "Don't take that from me." She sat with that for a moment. It was the kind of thing that was easy to receive wrong, as dismissal or as the pride of a man who didn't want to be helped. But she knew him well enough by March to hear it correctly. Not leave me alone, but let me own my decisions. "All right," she said. "All right." She got up and put another log on the fire, and the room brightened. It was mid-March, on a Thursday, when the thing happened that none of the account-keeping or legal documentation or careful preparation could have covered. Ethan had gone out alone that morning to transport a load of cut timber down the North Ravine Trail, a route he'd used 100 times, rocky and steep, but manageable in dry conditions. The problem was that the conditions were not dry. A 3-day melt followed by an overnight freeze had left the trail covered in a skin of ice that looked like wet rock and behaved like glass. Claire had said, that morning over breakfast, "The North Trail's going to be bad." "I've done it worse," he'd said. "That's not the reassurance you think it is," she'd said. He'd gone anyway, because the mill contract had a delivery schedule, and the delivery schedule was what kept the payments on track, and that was the math he was doing. Clara had spent the morning on accounts, then the afternoon repairing the split in the barn door that had been worsening for a week, then the early evening starting supper, watching the light change through the window with the low-level awareness she'd developed over months of mountain living, the specific quality of late afternoon light when the temperature was dropping faster than expected. Ethan should have been back by the middle of the afternoon. By 4 o'clock, he wasn't back. By 5 o'clock, the light was failing and the temperature had dropped sharply, and Clara was standing on the porch, looking at the tree line with the kind of stillness that precedes action rather than following it. She went inside, put out the fire carefully, dressed in everything warm she had, took the rope from the hook by the barn door, and saddled Ellis. She rode into the dark. The North Trail was bad. She knew it was bad before she reached it, and it was worse than she'd expected anyway. Ellis picked her way down it with the careful mistrust of an animal that knew ice and didn't like it, and Clara let her take her time because hurrying here would put them both down, and that helped no one. The trees closed in. The moon was thin but present. She rode with the rope coiled across the saddle and Ethan's name somewhere in the back of her throat, not called out yet, just waiting. She heard the horse first, Flint, not panicked, but restless, the short, sharp sounds of an animal that was tied and couldn't move toward something it wanted to reach. She followed the sound off the main trail through a stand of pines and found the edge of the ravine in the moonlight. Flint was tied to a pine 20 feet back from the edge. Below, she looked, and the cold in her chest became something larger. The timber load had gone through the ice of the frozen creek bed. The logs were scattered and half submerged in black water that had broken through the freeze, and Ethan was down there, in the water up to his chest, one arm hooked over a lodged log and the other pressed against the ice shelf at the bank, his face white in the moonlight, his breath coming in shallow, visible bursts that were slowing down. "Ethan?" Her voice came out flat and controlled, which took effort. He looked up. The relief on his face was complicated by the evident difficulty of remaining conscious. "Clara." His voice was wrong, slurred slightly at the edges, thick with cold. "Ice gave. Logs." "Don't explain," she said. "Save it." She was already off Ellis, already uncoiling the rope. "Can you hold on?" "Yes." A pause. "For a while." For a while was the most honest and terrifying answer he could have given. She tied the rope to the pine nearest the bank edge, tested it with her full weight, found it solid, and went down the bank on her stomach, distributing her weight across the ice the way you had to do it. Flat, slow, no sudden movements. The ice complained under her. She ignored it. The rope burned through her gloves, and she ignored that too. She got to the bank edge and reached down, and he got one hand on the rope, and then she had his wrist, and the cold of his skin through her gloves was like grabbing iron in January. Getting him out took 15 minutes and felt like an hour. He couldn't use his legs properly. Too cold, the muscles locking up. And Clara was not large, and the bank was steep, and the ice kept threatening, and there were 2 moments where she was genuinely not sure the physics were going to work in their favor. She talked to him the whole time, not encouragingly, not sentimentally, just a steady stream of practical instruction. Grip here, push with your right, don't use that arm, yes, like that, keep going. Because she'd learned that his particular kind of stubbornness responded to being given a clear task better than it responded to being asked to hang on. He came over the bank edge and collapsed onto the snow, and she pulled him away from the edge by his coat collar with both hands bleeding through the rope-burned gloves, and sat there in the snow beside him breathing hard while he coughed water and tried to remember how to use his hands. "Flint," he managed. "I'll get Flint," she said. "Can you stand?" "Give me a minute." "You don't have a minute. You need to be moving." She got her shoulder under his arm and hauled him upright with the kind of effort that left bruises she'd find later. "Walk. Now." He walked. Badly, leaning on her, his coordination shot by the cold. But he walked, and she kept him walking the 50 feet to where Ellis and Flint were tied, and got him onto Flint because Flint was his horse and would manage him better than Ellis would, and tied him loosely to the saddle because she wasn't confident his grip would hold the whole way up. The ride back up the mountain was the longest hour of her life. She watched him the whole way. His color, his breathing, whether his hands were gripping. He was conscious and talking, which were the 2 things that mattered, though what he was saying was fragmented and slightly beside the point, the way conversation got when the body was using most of its resources for more urgent purposes. "I told you the trail was bad," she said at one point, because she needed to say something, and that was what came out. "You did," he admitted. "I'm going to keep saying that." "Fair enough," he said, and his voice was slightly less slurred than it had been at the creek, which she decided to count as progress. She got him to the cabin. She got the fire rebuilt in under 4 minutes, got him out of the wet clothes with an efficiency that left no room for self-consciousness, got him wrapped in every blanket in the cabin and as close to the fire as was safe. She made coffee and made him drink it, and made more and made him drink that too. She checked his hands and his feet for the gray-white patches that meant the cold had gotten deep enough to do real damage. Found nothing definitive, kept checking. She did not sleep that night. She sat beside him, and kept the fire, and kept checking and talked to him when he drifted because she'd been told once that the voice was an anchor, and she believed it. Sometime past midnight, he said clearly, "Clara, I'm here. You came out in the dark. You were not back when you should have been." A long silence, the fire speaking for both of them. His color was better, his hands were warmer. "I was thinking," he said slowly, like the words were being assembled with care, "about what you said when you first got here, about not wanting to be a shadow in someone else's unfinished story." She waited. "I think you should know," he said, "that this is your story now. Whatever it is, it's yours." He turned his head and looked at her, and his eyes in the firelight were completely clear and completely serious. "I just want to keep being in it." Clara sat beside him in the firelight with her rope-burned hands and her heart doing something she hadn't given it permission to do. And she looked at this man who had gone into a frozen creek trying to keep a payment schedule, who had stood in a mountain clearing and offered to break himself financially for her freedom, who had carved initials out of a doorframe in the dark because she'd asked him to. This man who was imperfect and stubborn and not easy, and had never once pretended otherwise. She reached out and put her hand over his. "You're the first place that ever felt like home," she said. She hadn't planned to say it. It was simply the most accurate thing she had, and it came out. He turned his hand under hers and held on. Outside, the mountain did what it always did. It endured, cold and indifferent and vast. But inside the cabin, in the unsteady light of a fire that a woman had rebuilt alone in the dark after riding into a blizzard to pull a man out of a frozen creek, something had settled into place. Not perfectly. Nothing about any of this was perfect, but solidly. The way things settle when they're actually real. Ethan recovered slowly, which frustrated him in the specific way that physical limitation always frustrated a man who had built his entire relationship with the world around what his body could do. He was up on the third day, which was too soon, and Clara told him so directly. He sat back down, not because she told him to, but because his legs informed him she was right, and he respected factual evidence. The cut on his hand from January had barely finished healing before the creek had added new damage. 2 fingers on his right hand had gone deep enough into the cold that they came back tender and unreliable, aching in certain temperatures, slow to grip. The camp doctor who came up from Hollow Creek on the 4th day said the feeling would likely return in full over several months, or mostly return, or partially return. He was not encouraging in his specificity. Clara thanked him, paid him, and when he left, she stood at the window for a long moment before turning back to the room. Ethan was watching her from the chair by the fire. He'd been watching her do a lot of things lately. Not in the half-suspicious, half-cautious way of those first weeks, but with the particular attention of a man who had recently understood something about himself and was still getting used to the understanding. "Say what you're thinking," he said. "I'm thinking the March delivery is going to be short," she said, which was true and also not the whole truth. "I'm going to write to the mill and ask for a 2-week extension on the schedule. They won't like it. They won't love it," she agreed, "but they'll prefer it to us defaulting entirely, and I'm going to frame it exactly that way." She turned from the window. "Your hands need time. The mountain will still be here when they're ready." He looked at his right hand, at the 2 fingers he was still learning to trust again. "Victor's payment schedule won't wait 2 weeks. I've already written to Garfield," she said. "I cited the injury, I attached the doctor's written account, and I informed them that the terms of the agreement did not account for force majeure, which is a legal concept I am fairly confident Garfield knows and Victor will not like being reminded of." She paused. "We're within our rights." Ethan looked at her. There were things he'd gotten used to about Clara over these months. Her directness, her methodical intelligence, the way she moved through problems like she was solving arithmetic rather than panicking. But there were still moments when the full weight of what she was capable of landed on him fresh. "When did you write to Garfield?" he said. "The morning after you came out of the creek," she said, "while you were asleep." He was quiet. Then, "You hadn't slept." "I slept a little." This was a technical truth. She had put her head down for perhaps 90 minutes around 4 in the morning. It needed doing. He didn't say thank you, which was correct, because thank you would have diminished it. He just looked at her for a moment with that steady, full attention that had become the most reliable thing she knew about him. "All right," he said. Garfield's response arrived within the week. Victor had agreed to a 3-week extension grudgingly, with a notation that any further delays would void the agreement entirely. It was as much flexibility as Victor was capable of, which was not much, but it was enough. Ethan's hands came back stronger than the doctor had predicted, stubbornly and imperfectly, the way hands do when they belong to a man who refuses to coddle them and has a wife who refuses to let him destroy them either. Spring arrived late on Blackthorn Ridge, which was how it always arrived there, not as a gentle transition, but as a sudden argument with winter that winter eventually, reluctantly, lost. The snow retreated up the ridgelines. The creek ran fast and loud with snowmelt, as if making up for its recent bad behavior. The pines released their smell into the warming air, sharp and clean in a way that Clara had come to associate with the specific sensation of being somewhere she actually wanted to be. The story of the creek had gotten into Hollow Creek before they brought it themselves. The mill driver who'd come up to check on the delayed delivery had seen the broken ice, asked questions, and come down the mountain with an account that had grown somewhat in the telling by the time it reached the boarding house and the general store and the 3 or 4 places in a small town where information went to multiply. What arrived in the public understanding of Hollow Creek was this. Clara Mercer had ridden alone into a night storm and pulled her husband out of a frozen creek with her bare hands and kept him alive for 3 days by the fire. The part about the bare hands was slightly embellished. She had been wearing gloves, though by the end they were more rope than fabric. The rest was accurate enough. Ruth Calloway, who had told Clara in February that she'd brought trouble down on a good man, did not apologize. People like Ruth rarely did, but she stopped saying it, which was the practical equivalent. Mrs. Henderson told Clara directly on the next supply run that the town had been talking about her differently since March, and that she thought Clara should know. Clara thanked her and bought the extra pound of flour that Mrs. Henderson had been quietly adding to her orders all winter, and paid for it this time, which made Mrs. Henderson laugh for the first time in Clara's presence. Sheriff Purcell stopped her on her way out of the dry goods and fell into step beside her for half a block, which was his version of a private conversation. "Heard about the creek," he said. "News travels," she said. "On this mountain, yes." He walked a few more steps. "Garfield was back in town last week, asking around about your husband's finances." "I know," she said. "He does that periodically. Victor wants to know if we're close to breaking." "Are you?" She looked at him. "No." Purcell nodded. "I told Garfield the same thing, for what it's worth. Told him I'd personally witnessed the land registration, the payment documentation, and the legal filing of the marriage, and that anyone who wanted to challenge any of those things in my county was welcome to try." He paused at the corner. "Just so you know where I stand." Clara held his gaze for a moment. "Thank you, Sheriff." He nodded again and turned back the way he'd come, and that was the most emotional conversation she'd ever had with Dale Purcell, which was fitting for both of them. The payments continued going out. April. May. The timber contracts held. Ethan hired 2 men from town for the summer cutting, the first time he'd hired anyone in 3 years, a decision that cost money in the short term and bought him the physical capacity to maintain the pace the debt required. One of the men, a young Swede named Ander, who had arrived in Wyoming territory 6 months ago with no English and a remarkable facility for physical labor, turned out to be worth 2 of most men and was still there at the end of summer. Clara had started something else in April, quietly, without making a project of it. She had begun teaching reading twice a week in the back room of the dry goods store to 4 children whose families couldn't afford the territorial school fees. It had started because Mrs. Henderson mentioned that her granddaughter had no way to get to the school, and Clara had offered without thinking about it. And then 3 other children had appeared because word moved fast in Hollow Creek, and there was real hunger for it. It cost her 2 afternoons a week and a small amount of paper and ink, and it gave her something she hadn't known she'd been missing. The specific satisfaction of watching a child's face change when something that had been meaningless symbols became language. Ethan had said nothing about it when she told him, which she'd interpreted as indifference until she came home one afternoon in May to find a small shelf mounted on the backroom wall of the cabin, 6 books arranged on it, basic primers and a simple arithmetic text clearly purchased in Hollow Creek that morning. "For the children," he said, not looking up from what he was doing. She looked at the shelf for a moment. "Thank you," she said. "It needed doing," he said, which was what she said about things that were important but didn't need making a fuss over. And hearing her own phrase in his mouth did something to her chest that she decided not to examine too closely while standing in the doorway. Summer peaked and bent toward fall. The debt moved, not fast enough to feel like victory, but steadily enough to feel like direction, which was its own kind of oxygen for two people who had been operating on discipline and stubbornness for most of a year. Victor Hale came back to Blackthorn Ridge in September. He came alone this time, without Garfield, which was either a concession or a warning, and Clara wasn't sure which until she saw his face. He rode up the trail in the early afternoon on the same dark horse, in a coat slightly less formal than the one he'd worn in January, a small signal that registered. He tied his horse at the porch rail and stood in the yard, and this time he waited. Ethan came out of the barn. Clara came out of the cabin. They stood together in the yard, which was different from January in a way that was hard to articulate but easy to feel. Victor looked at both of them. Something moved across his face that Clara had never seen there before. Not softness, not regret, but something closer to the recognition she'd seen briefly in January. The acknowledgement of a category of person he didn't have a framework for. "The payments have been consistent," he said. "Yes," Ethan said. "Garfield tells me the documentation has been without error." "My wife is thorough," Ethan said. Victor's eyes moved to Clara. She met them without flinching, the way she'd been meeting difficult things since she was old enough to understand that flinching made them worse. "I owe you an honesty," Victor said, and the formality of it was so unexpected that she nearly blinked. "I came here in January expecting to leave with either you or the certainty of Mercer's failure within 6 months. A pause. "I was wrong about both." Clara said nothing, because she didn't know yet what this was. "I'm prepared to offer a revised settlement," Victor said. "The remaining balance, reduced by 15%, paid as a lump sum within 30 days, and the matter is concluded in full." The yard was quiet. A jay called somewhere in the pines. Ethan's hand was close to hers, not touching, just close, the way it had been since March. This habit of proximity that neither of them had decided on, and neither of them had stopped. Clara did the math in her head. The reduction was not generous. It represented Victor deciding that a certain amount of money now was preferable to a certain amount of money stretched over 2 more years with the maintenance costs of lawyers and bad faith. It was a businessman's calculation, not a moral one. She understood it for what it was. She looked at Ethan. He was already looking at her. "Walt Greer," he said quietly. Walt had said he'd stand for the first third. He had also, she recalled, not specified that his guarantee was limited only to the repayment schedule and not to a lump settlement. She had written that guarantee herself. She knew exactly what it said. "The timber contract paid ahead last month," she said, equally quiet. "And if we pull from the winter stores fund, we'd be tight through December. We've been tight through December before." She looked at him, at the set of his jaw and the question in his eyes that was not asking for permission, but asking for her thinking, because that was what they did now, and had done for months, and she thought about how different that was from everything she'd known before she came to this mountain. "Do it," she said. Ethan turned back to Victor. 30 days, he said. "We'll have the full settlement amount. I want the debt papers surrendered in Hollow Creek, in front of witnesses." Victor studied him. "That's an unusual condition." "It's the condition," Ethan said. Another pause. Victor looked once more at Clara, and she thought she saw it again, that flicker, the moment when a man who had spent his life operating in a world of transactions encountered something that didn't translate into that language, and had to decide what to do with the untranslatability of it. "Agreed," Victor said. He didn't extend his hand. Ethan didn't either. Some agreements are made in the air between people, witnessed by nothing but the trees. Victor rode back down the mountain. Clara and Ethan stood in the yard and watched him go. 30 days, Claire said. "Yeah, that's going to be a tight 30 days. "Yeah," he said again, and there was something in his voice that was tired and wry and not defeated, the voice of a man who had run the math and knew the answer was achievable even if it wasn't comfortable. She looked sideways at him. "We've had worse math." "We have," he agreed. The 30 days were, in fact, brutal. They sold the draft horse they'd been keeping as a spare, which Ethan had resisted until he did the numbers himself and arrived at the same conclusion Clara had. They renegotiated the mill contract for an advance against the fall delivery. Walt Greer contributed what the guarantee allowed, which was exactly what Clara's document had specified, not $1 more or less, and she respected him for that precision. On the 28th day, they rode into Hollow Creek together. Purcell was there. The Hendersons were there. Walt Greer had come down from his ranch for reasons he described as unrelated, and which were not unrelated. Ander the Swede was there because Ethan had asked him, and he hadn't questioned it. Ruth Calloway was there because Ruth Calloway was always where things were happening, which was its own form of participation. Garfield was there with the debt papers and the legal authority to accept the settlement. Victor was not present, which was its own statement. He had sent his lawyer to conclude what he had decided not to watch. Ethan handed Garfield the settlement payment. Garfield counted it with professional thoroughness, confirmed the amount, signed the release document, and handed the original debt papers across the table. He handed them to Ethan. Ethan looked at them for a moment. Then he turned and handed them to Clara. She stood in the back room of Purcell's office, holding papers that represented the transaction her father had made with her life, the weight of them in her hands thin and ordinary in the way that the most consequential things often were. The cabin stove was not here, but the Hendersons' iron stove, used for heating the dry goods back room in winter, was. She opened the stove door, put the papers in, and waited. The room watched. The papers caught. They burned fast, the way old documents did, the ink going first and then the paper itself, curling and blackening and reducing itself to ash in under a minute. Clara stood with the stove door open and watched every last corner turn to gray and then to nothing, and felt something she'd been carrying since she was 25 years old dissolve with it. Not cleanly, not completely, not in the storybook way where pain simply disappears, but genuinely, measurably, like a knot that had been worked at long enough finally coming loose. She closed the stove door. The room was quiet for a moment. Then Mrs. Henderson said something warm and practical about there being food next door, and the gathering moved as gatherings did. Ethan was beside her. He'd been beside her the whole time, close but not crowding, the way he always was, present in a way that left her room to be herself inside it. "How do you feel?" he said. She thought about it honestly. "Lighter," she said, "and tired, and hungry. Henderson's got food." "I know." She looked up at him. There was wood ash on his coat from the morning's work that he hadn't noticed, and his hair needed cutting, and the 2 fingers that had gone into the creek were still slightly stiffer than the others, and probably always would be. He looked exactly like what he was, a man who worked hard in difficult conditions and carried his history in his body and had chosen, against his own cautious nature, to let someone in. She loved him. She'd known it since somewhere around March, and had let herself know it properly since the night by the fire when he'd said, "This is your story now." She hadn't said it yet because she'd been waiting for a moment that felt like the right container for it, and she was beginning to think the right container was simply any ordinary moment between 2 people who had stopped performing and started being. "Ethan," she said. "Yeah, I love you." Straightforward, no theater. He looked at her. His face did the thing it sometimes did, a kind of slowing down, like the gears shifting into something that required more care. Then he said, "I know," in a tone that managed to be both utterly unromantic and completely sufficient, and then, because he was who he was, and not who anyone had ever mistaken him for, he said, "I loved you since February. I just didn't have the right to say it yet." "Since February," she repeated. "That's specific." "The night you reorganized the accounts without being asked," he said. "I looked at you across the table and I thought, this woman is going to be the reason I survive my own life. And then I thought I should probably not say that to someone I'd known for 3 months. Clara looked at him for a moment with the full weight of everything. The 1 bag, the church in November, the carved initials, the creek, the debt papers turning to ash. And then she laughed, not a small, polite sound, an actual laugh, the kind that came from somewhere unguarded, and it surprised her by how easy it was, how much room the mountain had made for it without her noticing. He smiled. It was still a rare thing on his face, and it was still, she thought, one of the most honest things she'd ever seen. They went next door and ate Henderson's food with the people of Hollow Creek, and Ethan talked more than he usually did, and Clara talked less than she usually did, and the balance between them was, as it had always been, its own particular kind of rightness. Victor Hale rode out of Wyoming Territory the following week, and as far as either of them ever knew, did not come back. He had other enterprises, other ledgers, other deals to make and unmake. Clara suspected he'd filed the whole episode in the category of anomalies, things that didn't follow the expected logic, that couldn't be leveraged or predicted, that were most efficiently forgotten. She understood that about him and felt nothing about it. Some people were not built for revision. That was their loss and their limitation, and she had spent enough of her life making it her problem. Her father wrote in October, a letter that had taken 3 forwarding addresses to find her, brief and somewhat evasive, in the tone of a man who knew he owed something large and was offering something small in its place. He was well. He was in St. Louis. He hoped she was comfortable. He did not ask about the debt. She wrote back, short, factual, with the deliberate emotional temperature of someone who had decided to keep a door open at a width appropriate to what was actually on the other side of it. She was well. She was in Wyoming. She was not comfortable. She was something better than comfortable. She did not explain what she meant by that. Some things were not for explaining to people who hadn't done the work to understand them. Winter came back to Blackthorn Ridge the way it always did. Without apology, without announcement. Just the one morning when you walked out and the air had changed and you knew. The first snow fell in October, light and exploratory, testing the ground. By November, it was serious. Ethan and Clara stood on the porch the first real snow morning of the season, cups in hand, watching the ridge go white. The cabin behind them was warm and stocked and solid. The accounts were in order. The eastern boundary was registered. The debt was ash in a stove in Hollow Creek. The doorframe where the initials had been was weathered now. The patch of raw wood that Ethan had cut away in November of last year blended into the gray of everything around it. You had to know what you were looking at to see it. Clara knew. She looked at it sometimes, not with pain and not with the pointed satisfaction of something defeated, but with the quiet acknowledgement that a scar could be evidence of survival rather than damage, depending on how you decided to read it. "What are you thinking?" Ethan said. "That we need to order more flour before December," she said. "That's what you're thinking." "That's one of the things I'm thinking," she said. He looked at her sideways, which was as close as he came to prying, and she looked back at him over the rim of her cup, and the mountains spread out below them, vast and indifferent and completely beautiful, in the way things were beautiful when they didn't care whether you noticed. She had come here with nothing, one bag, one letter, the basic arithmetic of survival, and she had built something she hadn't known how to imagine. Not a life she'd been promised, or a life she'd been sold, or a life someone else had decided she deserved. A life she had walked into, with her eyes open, on her own terms, in partnership with a man who had never once pretended to be easier than he was. That was not nothing. That was, in fact, everything. The mountain endured. The winters came. The cabin held. And inside it, 2 people who had arrived expecting very little had discovered, slowly and imperfectly, and with considerable difficulty, that the life you build with honest hands is the only one worth living in.